It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this year's event. Our keynote speaker for the conference is Dr. S. Brooke Vick. Dr. Vick is the Associate Provost for Faculty Diversity Initiatives and Associate Professor of Psychology at Muhlenberg College, a private liberal arts college in Allentown, Pennsylvania. She comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion leadership through her work as a social psychologist specializing in prejudice, discrimination, intergroup relations, and marginalized social identities. Dr. Vick's writing and research in the areas of prejudice and social stigma, inclusion, and equity in higher education has been published in journals of psychology and higher education, including Liberal Education and Perspectives in Psychological Science, among others. Outside of her work at Muhlenberg, Dr. Vick regularly works with faculty and staff at institutions and organizations across the country on inclusive and anti-racist policies, and currently serves as the president and co-chair of the Liberal Arts Diversity Officers Consortium. Please welcome Dr. Vick.
Well, hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. It is such an honor to be invited to be part of this gathering. I really want to thank Dr. Evans for introducing me and welcoming me into the space. I want to thank Jean McGivney-Burrell for reaching out to me with the invitation in the first place. No matter how many times I enter another educational community, I'm always incredibly honored and sometimes even surprised that I get invited. So I really am thankful for that, Jean. And Esther Natuli, thank you for all the work you've been doing behind the scenes to make our work together possible and to welcome me into the Idaho State community. So it is a pleasure and an honor to be with you tonight. I am going to pull up my slides for you so we can officially start the program here. So it'll just take me one moment. Okay, I think slides are up and you can see me, I hope. So I want to start today by, oops, I'm going to just, your face has popped up and I love to see you. I just need to move you that way. There you are. Okay, so I want to start today by telling you a little bit more about me. I thought that would be helpful, talking about what I'm doing now and really why is it that I'm here with you to talk about equity, to talk about engagement and access for all students at Idaho State and in the community where Idaho State resides. And first off, I know Dr. Evans mentioned that I am at Muhlenberg College in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I want to acknowledge that I am privileged to be joining you from the land of the Lenni Lenape people, the original stewards of much of the land in the northeastern United States, where I currently live and work. So at Muhlenberg, in my current position as Associate Provost, I serve as the college's Senior Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Leader. I work closely with faculty, staff, and students to develop learning and living experiences that welcome, support, and celebrate all members of our community. Prior to my current position, I was a full-time faculty member and social psychologist studying the effects of bias on members of marginalized populations. And I was also one of 3 or 4 Black faculty members on my campus. And so, like many underrepresented faculty and staff members, I had the privilege of serving as a sometimes formal, sometimes informal mentor for many other minoritized students, BIPOC students, first-generation students, LGBTQ students, undocumented students, and many more. And it was through those mentoring relationships where I consistently heard about their experiences in the classroom and with their instructors and professors that led them to feel othered, to doubt their abilities, to lose motivation and persistence, and to shut down, frankly. And I heard from others that experienced these moments as calls to action, and thus they exerted incredible amounts of emotional and physical energy to fighting for inclusion and equity and value within their communities. And whether these students followed either path, what I saw was the ways in which these experiences, their experiences of exclusion, took away from the thing that should have been able to be their focus, learning and developing as young adults into the people that they want to be, into the scholars and creators and thinkers and problem solvers that we want them to be. And long before that, I was one of a few Black undergraduate students at an historically white institution. And I had had the exact same experiences just 15 years or 20 years before they did. So upon that realization, I thought to myself, we can do better. And I decided that I needed to somehow be part of the effort to make those changes. And indeed, those experiences that students shared with me back then are happening across colleges and universities and in educational communities all over the country. Research from various campus climate studies sponsored by the Center for Racial Equity out of USC tells us that the least inclusive spaces on our campuses as a nation are our classrooms. As educators at a place like ISU that shares the value of student education and development, I'm guessing that hearing that hurts you as much as it did the first time I heard it, as much as it hurt me. But I know we can do better. And that's why I'm grateful for the invitation to join you today in your efforts to do better for your students and for your community. So my goal today is to hopefully contribute in some way to those efforts that I know you've already started. And I'm also looking forward to learning from you as well, because I know that whenever I'm speaking to a room full of educators, there's some learning I can do. So I'm really looking forward to being in conversation with you near the end of my remarks today. So I'm going to be talking about building inclusive environments for equitable outcomes, promoting access, participation, and learning within educational communities. And I just want to show you kind of an overview of where I think we're going to go with this. We're going to talk about what equity is, why it is that equity matters, why equity-minded practice matters for the outcomes that I think as educators we all really care about. And before we talk about strategies, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is it that keeps us from already achieving the goals of equity and inclusion and belonging for our students. What is it that we're working against? Because I think that once we know that, the strategies to improve that situation come into much greater focus. So we'll talk about that a little bit and then focus the rest of our time on strategies that we can use to promote equity and belonging. And it's my goal that you all leave here with some actionable things that you can do. If you were to step into a classroom on Monday, something that you could change and improve, small things, but that can make a really big difference. So to start with, I know that there's lots of talk about equity and inclusion in education, whether it's higher ed or K through 12 education over the last several years, and especially now, but I don't know that we always slow down enough to ask ourselves, what does this mean? And why is it important? Is this, we love a good buzzword in education, and like, how is this not just the latest buzzword? Why is it more than that? So I want to start by establishing a shared understanding of what it is we're talking about, to make sure that at least in our shared space, we're on the same page with what it is that equity and inclusion are all about. So I want to just start by simply reviewing and defining what these terms mean, how they're related to one another, so that we can start to connect the dots throughout the rest of the night. How does equity connect to inclusion? How does that connect to belonging? Where does it all fit together? So I want to start by showing you this graphic, which you've probably seen before. It's a really popular graphic, and that's why I can't get away from it. I think it's just so effective. But it's a good graphic to explain the differences between equality, equity, and justice, and to really zero in on what is equity. So if you look at the image on the left of the screen is showing you a picture of demonstrating equality. Equality here is represented by an approach where everybody is treated the same. And that's really a traditional way that we thought in education and in lots of other spaces for many years, that this is how we practice fairness. This is how we avoid bias and prejudice and discrimination. We're just going to treat everybody the same, and that's the answer that we want. But what you see with looking at this picture, if you think of the goal is I want to be able to see the soccer game. The barrier is that fence that's going to prevent people from seeing the soccer game. And here we gave everybody the same size box to stand on to overcome that barrier. But you can see that only 2 of the 3 people there have actually overcome the barrier with that support that we gave everybody else. So because these people are different heights, they actually need different supports to be able to overcome that barrier, to be able to see over the fence. So in the equity, in the middle of the screen, the equity image is showing you Everybody's heads are now at the same level over that fence, but they're standing on different size supports. And that's what an equity approach is. An equity is about addressing differential needs in order to equalize opportunities and participation and reduce gaps in the outcomes. And in our case, it's desired learning experiences and educational outcomes. So while equality focuses on what are we giving, what supports are we providing, equity focuses on the outcomes. What are the needs and what are the outcomes? And we want the outcomes to be the same, even if the supports aren't. So it's really outcomes focused. And when we're talking about education and learning, some of these outcomes that we're going to talk about today, they have to do with retention, with graduation rates, with participation in high impact practices, internships, studying abroad, faculty student research, whatever learning outcomes we want people to be achieving. So within a diverse population of students, we know that they're not going to have the same needs. They're not going to come to us with the same experiences or even experience the same barriers to participation and success. Someone, as Mark was mentioning in his introductory comments, someone that is underrepresented by disability is going to have different needs for support than someone who's underrepresented by their sexuality, by their age, by their race. So another important aspect of an equity-minded approach is recognizing the histories of oppression and the hierarchies that have shaped our systems of education and the ways in which those systems contribute to differences in student needs, experiences, and barriers within our educational sphere. So equity-mindedness, which is a term I'm going to use throughout the evening, equity-mindedness requires us to address individual needs while recognizing the ways in which they are rooted within systems that promote and sustain inequity. So we'll talk about individual approaches and we'll talk about systems today. Before we move on from this slide, I just want to point out the other panel on this picture that is focused on justice. And of course, justice is ultimately, that's our ultimate goal, which is to remove the barrier entirely. Equity is providing the supports to get everybody over that barrier. Justice removes the barrier entirely, so no one even needs supports. Everybody can see the game. Everybody can get those outcomes that we want. So if it's another way to remember this, equality occurs when everyone gets a shoe. Equity is when everyone gets a shoe that fits. So we're looking to provide what fits for all of our students, whatever age they're at, whatever developmental milestone they are in, whatever community they're in. So that's the equity piece. Where does inclusion fit in? So inclusion is really about what do we do with the diversity that is in our community. So diversity is just simply describing representation. Who is here? Who's around? What identities and backgrounds and experiences are represented in the space in our community? Inclusion is about the intentional engagement with the diversity within our communities. Less about who we are, more about what we do. What do we do to support, respect, welcome, and integrate diversity into everything we do? And that's why I love the Verna Myers quote. Verna Myers is a American legal scholar and a DEI expert. And she says, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. This and the puzzle image that I like here, because we can have a diverse space without having an inclusive space. Because everybody can just kind of be in the room, but they're not part of something bigger. They haven't been brought together into and integrated into a whole. And that's really what belonging is about. So belonging occurs when you feel like you're an integral and valued part of something that is bigger than you as an individual, and it's about being accepted for who you are. So what does inclusion look like? Inclusion in our educational communities can look like diverse voices being represented in areas of decision-making, on committees, in leadership, in planning programs like this one. It can be in curricular efforts to include underrepresented or marginalized perspectives. Hello. Okay. Curricular efforts to include underrepresented or marginalized perspectives in course material. Inclusion could happen in our co-curricular programming spaces, in those areas where we can celebrate marginalized and minoritized cultures and experiences. We can partner with community partners in community engaged projects and make sure we are including underserved perspectives in the design and execution of that work that we do in the community. Inclusion really looks like honoring, inviting, and listening to those voices that have been traditionally excluded from places of decision-making and leadership. So now I want to put all the pieces together and talk about how are these things connected. So the way I think about it is that inclusion makes equity more likely. It's not sufficient for equity, but it is necessary. So whenever we're focused on equity-minded approaches to teaching and learning, we have to also be engaged with creating more consistent experiences of inclusion for minoritized students, because inclusive experiences often predict greater equity in student outcomes. So there's a lot of research, and I've given you a few citations here, but just to highlight a few things we know. Sense of belonging, the piece that's in the middle of this slide here, sense of belonging predicts greater academic persistence. It predicts greater retention. It predicts the intention to pursue additional classes to complete the degree, and it predicts higher engagement and academic achievement. Lots and lots of things that we like to see in our students in education at every level. Sense of belonging predicts those things. And research on characteristics of spaces that signal inclusion or exclusion. So what are the things that are on our walls? What images? Who are we celebrating? What authors are included in the material we study? Those things that signal inclusion show that a lack of representation or lack of presence in our physical spaces affects sense of belonging. So if we think about connecting those dots, when the spaces we're in, the climate, the environment for learning that is created for us, sends inclusive messages, tells all of us, whoever we are, that we are valued and we are welcomed to come into that space as our whole self. That predicts a sense of belonging, where I feel like I'm part of something. I feel like I'm valued and seen and validated. And that leads me to engage in my classes, to be more open to learning, to persist when things get difficult, and to complete my degree or my certificate or whatever it is that I'm working toward. And that gives us the equitable outcomes. So we'll talk about this more in a few minutes, but suffice it to say that if we're concerned with equity in student learning and achievements and outcomes like performance and retention and degree completion, we need to be concerned with experiences of inclusion and belonging due to their effect on student performance. So inclusion alone, as I mentioned, not sufficient to achieve equity, because equity also requires that we look at our institution's policies and practices, that we look at how we are assessing outcomes. There's all sorts of things that need attending to, but it is necessary for sustained equity within our institutions that our students feel a sense of inclusion and belonging. So the suggestions that I'm going to offer today will address ways to make your students' learning experiences more inclusive and therefore equitable. And sometimes the interventions that I describe will address both equity and inclusion, and some will be one or the other. But generally, if you're working on one, the other is likely to follow because the two of those are linked. Okay, so as I mentioned at the beginning, before we get to all that good stuff about how we make things better, I do want to spend a few minutes identifying what are the threats to equity and inclusion that we need to be on the lookout for, that we need to avoid. And as I said, I think it's important to understand what we're working against so that those steps that make it better can come into greater focus. And where I want to start is actually what I mentioned in the title of my talk, which is to talk about our learning environments. And learning environments can be classrooms, but they can also be in a lot of different places in our communities, in our K through 12 classrooms, in our co-curricular spaces. Learning happens in a lot of environments, and those environments really matter. So I want to talk about climates for learning. And when I refer to climate, what I'm referring to generally is talking about the learning environment that we create for our students. But learning environment means a lot of kind of multiple environments all happening at the same time. There's an intellectual environment, there's a social environment, an emotional environment, and physical environment where our students learn. Another way that I think about an environment is to talk about, I often talk about the container. What is the container for learning that we are building for ourselves and for our students that encompasses all kinds of environmental characteristics? So it includes things like teacher-student relationships and interactions. The demographics of the participants in that learning space affect climate. The policies that govern our interactions in a classroom space, the course content, the topics we discuss and the topics that we don't, the tone and nature of the interactions between students, between learners in a class space, and lots of other things. But where I want us to go is to understand some of the characteristics that define a climate that we want to move away from, and then the characteristics that define the climate that we want to try to achieve. So what we want to avoid, I'm going to refer to, as Ambrose does, as a marginalizing climate. And a marginalizing climate is one that devalues, discourages, or excludes diverse or underrepresented perspectives. And that can be within the, it can be explicitly in discussion, it can be in the course material, but it can be explicit or it can be implicitly marginalizing. But either way, there's some kind of cue to marginalization that's happening in that space. So I want to just give you an example, and this is from a faculty member that I worked with not all that long ago, that came to me with a concern that she had accidentally created a marginalizing climate in her class. So this was a course, it was a course in education actually, where a faculty member was showing a clip from West Side Story during the class, West Side Story, the musical from back in the 1960s. So at the close of the clip that she showed, a Latina student raised her hand and asked a question about colorism in the casting of the film, the casting and shooting of the film, in that the characters in this story identify as Latino, Latina, Latinx, and she observed that she thought that there were white actors that were playing these roles. And so she raised her hand, asked a question about colorism. And the faculty member, as a lot of us often are, was focused on whatever the planned topic for class was that day. She had a lesson plan, and it did not include talking about colorism. And so her response to the student was that she dismissed the student's question and said, "That's not what we're talking about today," and moved on and did not engage that question. Now, after this colleague of mine left the classroom and was able to reflect on what had happened, she was really concerned. And she came to me realizing that the subtle message she may have sent to that student and to the class is to marginalize the interests and questions of an underrepresented student in her class, to marginalize issues that are culturally relevant and related to those things that were interesting to that student. And so she came to me to ask, how can I fix this? What can I do? I need to address this. But so that is something that is much more implicit in that it wasn't something that she intended to do. And she realized it later on. It may have been a little bit subtle, but these are ways that we can sort of explicitly or implicitly deliver the message that we're not really going to engage with talking about underrepresented issues or with marginalized perspectives. So as we discussed in the previous section, marginalizing climates more generally have been shown to reduce learning outcomes and achievement. They reduce perceptions of students' competence, their belief in themselves, their self-efficacy, and it reduces their sense of belonging. And that, of course, we know threatens the ability to achieve equitable outcomes. So we're going to come back to climate, talk about how we make it better here in a few minutes. Another threat to equity, inclusion, and belonging is the operation of negative stereotypes in our learning spaces. So many of our students, as Mark pointed out, diversity shows up in a lot of different ways. And many of our students who are members of marginalized groups or who embody a marginalized identity by race, by socioeconomic status, ability, citizenship, gender identity, et cetera, they are often coming into our institutions as targets of negative stereotypes about their abilities in one domain or another. And in US colleges and universities, in our K through 12 learning spaces, those stereotypes that impugn a group's worthiness and ability to succeed within our learning institutions are not only held by individuals, but they are institutionalized often within a system that was designed and developed to serve a very specific, very narrow population of people. those who were traditionally, historically held atop the racial, gender, socioeconomic, and ability hierarchies. But as a result, there are numerous circumstances within the way our institutions function in which students from marginalized groups may be reminded of, seen through, and treated according to negative stereotypes about their groups that then can contribute to inequities in learning and outcomes. So how does this all fit together? Well, what happens is, first, the majority of members of marginalized groups are aware of these negative stereotypes that apply to them. So whether there's anyone actually in the space that is endorsing or enforcing the validity of some stereotype, or is actively treating an individual in a stereotypical manner, your students know that others' expectations for them in academia are likely to be shaped by stereotypic perspectives. So Black students know the negative stereotypes about their intelligence or intellectual ability. Women know that they're not expected to perform as well as men in STEM fields. First gen and low income students are aware of the expectations that they come from underserved communities, that they are less prepared to succeed in college. Students with disabilities know the ways in which a variety of disabilities are erroneously tied to cognitive and intellectual abilities. Our students are aware of the stereotypes that are in the air that could apply to them and through which they could be perceived. And this awareness can contribute to experiencing stereotype threat for those students. And I'm guessing that is a concept many of you are familiar with, but just in case you haven't heard of that before, stereotype threat occurs whenever someone is performing in a domain within where those expectations of their performance are low, where they know there's a stereotype that's relevant to that performance. So I mentioned the stereotype about women in STEM. So if I am a woman and I'm taking a high-level calculus exam, I have an understanding, usually subconscious, but I have an understanding that if I perform really poorly on this exam, I'm going to confirm the stereotype that women aren't good at this. And that's not something that I want to do. So when we experience stereotype threat, we know that that can lead to actually affecting our performance in precisely the way that we were worried about in the first place, where we ironically end up confirming that stereotype. And the reason for that is because when we experience stereotype threat, there's a whole bunch of cognitive resources, kind of mental bandwidth that gets sucked away by that worry. I sort of think of it as, when your computer is buffering and there's a wheel that's spinning, I think about those stereotypes are that wheel. There's a wheel spinning. There's something that is sucking away the computer's bandwidth. And that keeps us from giving that cognitive capacity to what should be our focus, focusing on learning and applying what we're learning and performing and demonstrating our potential in those learning spaces. So if negative stereotypes are active, stereotype threat can happen, and that then contributes to equity gaps, where we see disparities in student outcomes that happen between demographic groups, where those students who are grappling with negative stereotypes are underperforming compared to those students who are not. So we need to be aware of how are negative stereotypes entering into the space. Another threat to inclusion and equity are our own biases as instructors and educators. Biases on the part of the instructor have been shown for many, many decades to negatively impact student learning and performance. What's interesting, though, is it's been shown in more recent years that these same effects occur with implicit biases, as well as those explicit ones. So implicit biases, those are those that exist and operate subtly, typically outside of our conscious awareness. This is sort of accidental bias. It just reflects strong associations that we have developed over time as we've been socialized between groups and characteristics. And these actually have a negative effect on students and faculty, interestingly enough. So one study showed that among faculty and instructors, that implicit racial biases of a white instructor when teaching Black students actually hurt the instructor, such that they demonstrated higher anxiety during the lesson and delivered a lower quality teaching performance, a lower quality lesson. And that ended up causing lower test performance in Black students. So the biases harmed the performance of the instructor and the performance of the students, and nobody really knows what's going on, what is driving that. It's a bias that is subconscious. We also know that implicit biases of instructors can lead to subtle patterns of differential treatment of minoritized students compared to majoritized students. So we see different patterns of people being called on, invited to participate in the learning space. We see different responses to student questions, less personalized help, even some research that shows conveying less overall warmth in really subtle ways toward minoritized students. And all of these examples result from implicit biases. So we have to remember, this is often not intended. These are not even noticed patterns of behavior on the part of many of us as educators. So taken together for students then, these subtle bias cues signal a marginalizing climate, which is more likely to trigger stereotype threat and other related self-doubts that threaten equitable outcomes. And these are things for students like decreased performance, less frequent participation in class, and just decreased engagement. They're more likely to withdraw, to disengage from the learning environment and from the material that you're hoping they will learn. So marginalizing climates, negative stereotypes, instructor biases, we also have to keep an eye out for yet another threat to inclusion, and that is the microaggressions that can happen within learning spaces. This is another term that I'm assuming many of you are familiar with, but just as a reminder, microaggressions are those frequent, sometimes daily, often unintentional slights, invalidations, acts of disrespect that remind students of their marginal or minoritized identity in negative ways. They can be really subtle, implicit, kind of under the radar, tiny moments that can really add up to do quite a bit of harm in reminding students that they are somehow different, they are separate, not included, they don't belong in that space. So although these can occur anywhere in our learning communities, on our campuses, they frequently occur in classrooms. And they can happen between faculty and students. They happen between student and among student peers. And some examples of this, I have the image in front of you, the where are you really from? This is a very common microaggression that happens to people who are deemed to be not originally from this country because they happen to look a certain way. And when someone, when someone who appears to be Asian is asked where they're from, someone is expecting them to say a foreign country, and they say, I'm from Washington, they get, well, okay, but where are you really from? And what that does is it's this subtle message that I don't believe that you can be part of the group that I'm a part of. I don't believe that you can be American. I don't believe that you can be from Idaho because you look this way. Other examples that are happening that I know I'm talking about a lot on my campus, misgendering trans or gender non-binary students. So using a name that they formally use that is no longer their chosen name, or applying a pronoun that is incorrect based on the gender that they now claim, referring to a Muslim student in jest and saying that they look like a terrorist because of the hijab that they are wearing, assuming that an Asian American or a Latinx student doesn't speak English, maybe because their writing has some development that needs to happen. Any number of these things could be, they could be jokes, they could be well-intentioned, they could be completely come unawares, but all of those harm a student's sense of belonging and spotlight them in their identities in ways that convey that their identities aren't understood, they're not valued, they're not respected in that learning space. And this too can contribute to bandwidth reduction and then have that negative impact again on learning outcomes. If a microaggression happens in the classroom and we don't address it, which we're going to talk about how to address later on today, students have checked out because now that little wheel is now much bigger because something happened in the space that reminded them, oh, I am other, I don't belong here. And that then, as we know, has an impact on learning outcomes, as well as the quality of relationships and their experiences in that learning environment. And we know that relationships really matter in terms of the climate for learning. But wait, there's more. Yet another threat. This is why we haven't achieved this yet. It's hard. There's a lot we have to pay attention to. Another is a lack of representation. Representation matters, as it says on your slide here. The thought is, and what all of our research shows, is that when diverse identities are represented in a space, it shows students, shows all of us, that this is something that I could be, this is something that I could do, I can see myself in this role. If you can see it, you can be it. So when there is a lack of diverse and positive representation of underrepresented identities, we can see a threat to equity and inclusion. So there's lots of types of representation to think about here. It can come in the form of course materials. So when a course list doesn't include any scholars from underrepresented or marginalized groups, when a course isn't highlighting the contributions of underrepresented scholars, artists, practitioners, when a course doesn't include those narratives, experiences, perspectives of minoritized communities, when our faculty, staff, leadership of our institutions, of our schools don't reflect the diversity of the student body, if any of that is happening, students who identify with those groups are more likely to perceive that they don't belong, that this field is not for them, or even that pursuing higher education is not for them. And I can think back in my own experience as an undergraduate, one of the first courses I took as a first-year student was a philosophy course. And as you know, I ended up majoring in psychology, but I took a philosophy course and I really liked it. And I did really well. I got an A, and my philosophy professor came to me afterwards and said, I know you're just a first year, but you should really consider majoring in philosophy. You really have a knack for thinking this way. And that was such a foreign idea. I hadn't considered at all philosophy, because philosophy isn't even something that high schoolers ever get to take, really. But the reason I decided that I couldn't imagine myself studying philosophy, and it was because I think, as I look back on it, every person that I read in that philosophy class, an intro to philosophy class, they all looked the same. They were all men. They were all white. Many of them had white beards. And I enjoyed it and I learned a lot, but it was really difficult to see, where do I fit in here? Where are the things that I care about, the things that I want to study? It was just, I couldn't imagine myself in that field. And now, so many years later, that I have philosophy colleagues and I know the work that they do, I know that that wasn't true, that there was work that really could have been mine. But it wasn't represented to me in that first chance I had at it. And I never went back to it until much, much later on, as I was getting my advanced degrees. So my point here is that lack of representation threatens a sense of belonging and inclusion, which can then have a negative impact on persistence and retention within our degree programs, within our fields and our courses. And the last one I want to talk about is specifically about access. So when I was showing the equity, equality, and justice slide, we could think about access sort of as being able to see over that fence, right? What is it that is keeping people from, our students from, accessing all of the amazing learning opportunities that we're working so hard to design and develop and support for them? And there's a lot of different barriers to access to be aware of. I mean, one, of course, is the financial barriers. Barriers to access include really anything that prevents students from accessing supports and services that are meant to support their success, and that can contribute to inequities. But financial barriers can be about, they can be explicit, like, you know, the cost of studying abroad, for example, or participating in a program. They can also be more subtle, and they're harder to notice. So, for example, we might be offering a class that has a community engaged component where students are going to be working with community partners, they're going to be going off campus. It's a wonderful, enriching experience. But there may be students for whom it's really hard to access that course because the schedule of that makes their off-campus employment more difficult. And that may be a student that needs that job to be able to continue in the program, continue in their degree. So watching out for both explicit and hidden financial barriers is important. Other barriers are more about the hidden curriculum. The hidden curriculum, those sort of, those unspoken things, that kind of the norms that run the way our institutions of education work. So in Anthony Jack's book, The Privileged Poor, he talks a lot about the hidden curriculum. I highly recommend that book, where he interviews and talks to a lot of first generation and low income students that went to elite colleges. And they talk about how they don't come into college with an understanding of a lot of our jargon, a lot of the sort of implicit academic rules. So they don't necessarily understand, they don't know that office hours, they don't know what that language means, what that is for. Maybe don't know the norms about accessing academic resources like tutors and writing centers and counseling support. So if students don't know about how and what to access to support their success, the existing inequities that they come into college with are likely to persist or even expand. So we have to make sure that we are providing, a thesaurus, that we're providing a path into some of these hidden ideas. Okay. So as we turn our attention now to talking about how we fix all this, how do we discuss specific things we can do to improve equity and inclusion and create environments that promote the success of our students, let's just keep these things in mind, those things that pose threats to our goals: marginalizing climates, negative stereotypes and their effects on students' sense of self-efficacy and their ability, instructor biases, and we all have them, myself included, microaggressions, a lack of representation, and barriers to access. So we'll keep those in mind and see if we can't come up with additional creative ways to develop environments that limit the influence of these threats. All right, now the good part. What can we do? Well, it turns out there's a lot we can do, in fact. We can do a lot, and I've come up with a list, and I'm going to go into each one of these things separately and try to provide you with a couple of strategies and examples in each one of these categories. Let's see how far we get. I'm watching our time. I think we're good. We've got plenty of time. So we can talk about things that we can do even outside the classroom, practicing engaging self-reflection. We'll talk about relationships, getting to know your students and what should we know and how do we get to know them. Cultivating a centralizing climate, which is the opposite of the marginalizing climate we've been discussing. Helping our students facilitate meaning making. Increasing representation, which we know is a direct threat to equity and inclusion. Helping to decrease uncertainty. Embracing flexibility, which we've all learned way more about than we ever thought we would, given that we're lived through a pandemic and still are. And then monitor results. How do we make sure that the things that we're trying are having the impact that we want them to have? And so I'm going to talk about each one of these things for a few minutes and give you some examples that I hope will be helpful for you. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, the expectations, beliefs, and biases that we as educators, as instructors, bring into the classroom can have a significant effect on students' learning experiences and their achievement. Most of us, especially if we were educated in the United States, were educated within a system that privileged techniques, approaches, ideas that maintain racial, gender, and socioeconomic hierarchies. So our default is likely going to maintain those systems because that is the way in which we were taught and educated. So in order to grow our capacity to enact more equitable practices, we're going to need to engage in regular and intentional self-reflection on our own teaching to be sure we aren't defaulting to the methods that serve only some of our students well. So as you practice this, there's going to be a number of things I'll encourage you to think about, to self-reflect on biases. So in my classes this week, did I notice any patterns that could have been influenced by biases? What about my learning goals? Have I identified learning goals that are specific to inclusion and belonging? And if so, how have I been acting on those goals today or this week or this term? What am I doing on purpose to make those goals happen? Am I operating on my goals? Am I paying attention to the overall student experience? Are students engaged in the classroom? Do I see patterns that look like they're showing me that students are not having an equitable experience in my class? Am I messaging that I'm valuing the inclusion of diverse experiences and identities? How am I showing that? So actively self-reflecting and building a practice where this becomes routine is really important, because again, if we don't do this, we will default to just serving a portion of our students. I can give you a kind of messy example of how I did this. I tried to do this anyway, when I was a full-time professor, which I did for over a decade before I moved into the role I'm in now. So when I was a full-time faculty member, I had a regular practice that I followed after every class that I taught. So every class meeting where I was with students, I would come back to my office, and usually students are following you back because they want to talk to you after class. So I would just ask them to give me just a couple minutes, just give me a minute. While everything was really fresh, I'd sit down at my computer and open up my notes for that day. And I'd type at the bottom of the notes, how did it go? and I typed it in a different, like bold or a different font so that I could always find it really easily every year. How did it go? And I would just really quickly include notes about certain activities we did, difficult ideas we grappled with, and how I thought students engaged or didn't, what they understood or didn't. But I also took the opportunity to note my observations with respect to my teaching goals around inclusion and equity. Did I encourage a diversity of student participation today? Was I able to convey valuing of underrepresented perspectives? Did I notice any missed opportunities to clarify my expectations or to engage a different viewpoint? Sometimes that was my spot to go, shoot. Like I can kind of journal a little bit and go, that didn't go the way I wanted it to go. And then the next year when I get to teach that class again, or the next term, I pull out those notes because I'm basically going to do what worked before. But if something didn't work, it's right there for me. And there'll be a note that says, remember, there was an opportunity here that you missed to further that goal. So it's something, I say it was messy because sometimes it would be a couple words and sometimes it would be a paragraph, but I really did do it every single class period. And like any new habit or practice that we try to adopt, it can be easier when you work on it with other people. So, I've worked with faculty learning communities, caucus groups, even smaller accountability buddies can be a great tool to use to start to begin a practice of self-reflection. It doesn't have to look the way that mine looked, whatever feels good for you. But to begin this practice of asking questions about how are our teaching practices contributing to our students' outcomes on a regular basis. And I'll remind you too, above all, remember to practice what my colleague Kim Case calls pedagogical humility. Give yourself some grace. We are always learning as educators. And I mean, just like our students, much of the time we learn the biggest lessons from mistakes that we make. So don't expect yourself to get it right every time or to even know what the right thing is to do every time. It's okay to make mistakes and admit what you don't know, even to students. But do reflect on what is working and what isn't with compassion for yourself and keep doing the work to engage and improve. So basically the bottom line here is don't allow a self-reflection practice to become a self-flagellation practice, which I notice when I look back at some of my notes, I'm pretty mean to myself sometimes. And so I'm warning you not to do that like I did. Be kind to yourself as you do this. Okay, let's get to know our students. That's another thing that we can do to really help promote inclusion. So one of the many ways that sort of classic ivory tower of higher education conveys to minoritized students that they're not welcome is the way that we privilege rational, supposedly objective methods of pursuing knowledge that convey that students should leave their identities, their cultures, their lived experiences at the door when they enter our classrooms. They're supposed to come in and we are academicians, we are intellects, and that is all we are in the sort of classic tradition of academia. Now, we know that whether or not we expect that of students, that expectation is an impossible, and I would argue undesirable expectation for students to meet. Students are no better able to leave these central aspects of who they are outside of their learning than we are able to leave those central aspects of who we are outside of our teaching. So additionally, if we aren't getting to know our students and learning about who they are in holistic ways, we're often cutting off information that we can really leverage to support our students' success. So what we want to do instead is welcome students' whole selves into the learning space. All of their identities, all of the things that make them uniquely them, the experiences, the culture, the worries, the interests, all of those things, we should acknowledge and validate as welcome into the learning spaces that we're creating. So what should we want to know? What is going to help us to create these inclusive environments? Well, one easy answer to that is kind of whatever they will trust us to share can be useful information. We don't want to pressure them to reveal things they're uncomfortable revealing, of course, or that would be inappropriate for them to share with us given our relationship with them. But it is important to ask them things like, what excites them? What are they interested in? What inspires and motivates them to be with us in the learning spaces that they volunteered to join? if they were volunteers. In K through 12, they may not be volunteers, but that they are at least joining us and willing to engage with us. What are they afraid of? What are they worried about? What concerns do they have? As we know that anxiety and uncertainty also leads to inequities and poor learning outcomes. So tell me about what you're worried about. What are their funds of knowledge that they're coming in with? So, you can use this information or this exercise I'm going to share to gather information about their strengths too. What kind of understanding and experiences are students bringing to class that can actually help them to succeed? And we know as educators, all students bring something to the table that can contribute to their learning. We should try to find out what those are and be able to help our students to recognize them as strengths, which often, especially first-gen students, minoritized students, won't necessarily recognize some of those strengths. We can help them connect the dots and say, this thing that you're bringing to class is actually going to help you do well in my class. Now, I'm often asked, though, okay, so how do you get this information from students without being intrusive or inappropriate or just downright creepy? I've had some colleagues go, this seems weird, how do you do it? And I think the key is to invite students to share themselves with you and the class and convey that whatever they bring to that exercise is welcome. And some students will feel open to share much more than other students. And all of that is okay. But when you engage in some icebreakers, which we all do, breaking the ice in that first class, those first weeks, we want to be able to convey, however we structure those icebreakers, that whatever you bring, I want to learn about it. I'm interested, I'm invested, and I'm going to validate and affirm who you are in this space. So icebreakers can be a really helpful tool to help students get to know each other and to help you get to know your students, especially if they're designed in such a way that invites students to share their similarities and differences. That allows them to communicate their identities, their experiences, their cultures are welcome and will be acknowledged and valued in class. Another thing I think is important about sharing similarities and differences is that it can make the diversity that's present in the room more visible for you and your students. So as Mark mentioned earlier, I think, there are many types of diversity that aren't necessarily visible physically. Diversity isn't all about race or about physical attributes. So, and this is perhaps especially true in smaller communities and rural areas. So if everyone looks relatively similar, students can assume a certain degree of homogeneity in that space, which usually isn't there. All of our spaces are diverse in multiple ways. But if we assume that everyone's the same, it can lead to some harmful, insensitive interactions down the road. So I always try to bring out those similarities and those differences. It gives us an opportunity to make that diversity visible and to demonstrate the valuing and respect of the individuals in the room. And an extra bonus here is it can also help us to design culturally responsive learning experiences. If we know more about who our students are, where they're coming from, what is relevant to them, then as we're designing assessments and engagement activities for their learning, we can better design them to connect with things that are relevant in their lives, that are culturally responsive. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here later on. So I want to give you an example of one icebreaker that my colleague, Kathy Olison, uses that does focus on similarities and differences. So she has her students do what she calls partner introductions. So she has them partner up, right there in the name, work with one other student in class that they don't know, and they introduce themselves to each other. So it's sort of a dyadic listening/interview experience. So students are required to listen actively to the other person because they are going to be responsible for introducing their partner to the class. What we know about active listening is it is a really great way to show valuing and respect and validation of another person, to just sit and focus on what it is that they're offering and to parrot that back to them is a great way to validate someone and to have someone feel seen. So she has them actively listen. They introduce themselves. They can include their gender pronouns if they desire. They make sure that they pronounce their name correctly. That's a really important way to, again, validate and affirm somebody's identity, getting the name right. And then they share 3 self-characteristics. A characteristic about themselves that is they think will be a relatively unique quality. So something that you think most people in class won't share. They share a quality that they're pretty sure other people will share. So if they're in an upper level education course and they say, I'm an education major, that's probably something that a lot of people in the course will share. That's a similarity. And then ask them to share a quality that they aren't sure how common it will be. Maybe it's somewhere in the middle and they throw it out there. And usually you end up finding that there's 1 or 2 people in the room where they'll say me too, and they'll have those connections. But that's one example of being able to acknowledge and welcome similarities. So you're finding that common ground, which is great, fun. And then there's also the differences that highlight the diversity. So some faculty have taken to pairing these kinds of icebreakers with a more expanded kind of written form, a written kind of first week interview that allows students to privately share information that they'd like their professor to know. And I think these have been really helpful, especially during the time when we had to pivot to remote learning and all of our students did not have equitable learning environments at home that we try to create at our schools. So forums that are asking things like, is there anything happening in your world right now that you're concerned could interfere with your ability to engage in class? Are you concerned about anything? Do you have the devices that you need? Do you have the resources that you need to engage with class? Do you have your textbooks? So this is something that is one of those practices that grew widely during the height of COVID-19 that I hope that we'll hold on to, that educators will continue to practice and use, because I think it really did help us to connect with our students better. Another way we can work on improving inclusion and equity is to work on our climate, to cultivate a centralizing climate. So that is one in which the opposite of marginalizing, one in which diverse perspectives are included and welcomed and invited into our learning experiences. So one of the ways we can do this is to set the tone for student-faculty interactions and for the climate in our classrooms from day one in our syllabus by including statements with respect to diversity and inclusion, where we're essentially stating our goals. We're being really transparent about this is the environment I want to create, and these are my values, and this is what I hope that all of us can agree to create in the classroom. So I have a couple of examples for you. These are actual statements from syllabi of faculty that I know, and they've agreed to allow me to use these examples for you. And they're really different. One comes from a neuroscience professor. So not always the usual suspects of courses where we might think this is particularly relevant or part of the topic. And then another that comes from a course in African-American literature. So let's just take a look at this example here. So from my colleague in neuroscience, she says in her syllabus, my top priority for classroom culture is to foster a learning community where all voices are heard and no voices are disposable. Overt hate speech will not be tolerated at any time, including speech targeting race, gender, religion, and disability. However, not all harmful speech comes in the form of direct insults and slurs. Microaggressions and implicit bias can create an environment that is emotionally unsafe for a subset of students without the perpetrator's intent. As a community, we will learn best when we are all comfortable being honest and wrong. Nobody ever learned anything new and challenging without being wrong. This will require supporting each other by educating ourselves about microaggressions and biased language. And she goes on underneath this statement to actually provide resources for students to go and learn more about implicit bias, to learn more about microaggressions and what they can do. What I really like about this, besides the fact that she provides resources, is that she goes into some detail here. So she doesn't just say, I value diversity and inclusion. She talks about what does that mean to foster an inclusive learning community to her. It means speech, it means support, it means honesty. So, and actually naming microaggressions and bias, being really specific about what it is that she's hoping everyone can work on together. Another example I'm including is from this course in African-American literature, and I want to include it because one might assume that a course in African-American literature that probably is going to count for a diversity requirement of some kind maybe doesn't need a statement like this because we're already centering underrepresented voices in that course. But look what my colleague, Dr. Cusick, does here. She says, the books, stories, and articles we will be reading are meant to represent the multiplicity of identities that comprise African-American literature. The course is intended to reflect the experiences of as many different African-American groups as possible, including African-American populations with disabilities, African-Americans of various religions, Black LGBTQIA+ communities, African-Americans of immigrant backgrounds, of various class backgrounds, and African-American people with identities at the intersections of these and countless other categories. One of the key goals of this course is to understand that the literature known as African-American literature is comprised of countless individuals with various perspectives and experiences, and it's precisely that variety and difference that this course celebrates. So here is a place where students might presume, I'm learning about African Americans, obviously diversity is part of this. But too often, and this is how stereotypes proliferate, we tend to see minoritized groups as homogenous, where we don't necessarily recognize that all social identity groups and cultures are heterogeneous. There are diverse experiences and voices and perspectives to be represented even within one particular minoritized group. So I love what she does here by bringing that out to say, oh no, there's diversity here too. And we are going to make sure that we include all of those stories and perspectives as we move along in this course together. So diversity and inclusion statements on syllabi are a great way to set the tone right in the beginning as they're reading, what is this course about, to say, here are my goals and values with respect to inclusion and diversity. Another way to do this, to cultivate a centralizing climate, is to work with your class to develop a set of community agreements. Community agreements is a collaborative exercise where, so you aren't, as an instructor, telling people what everybody's going to agree to, but you are working together to build a set of aspirational goals or agreements that kind of outline the goals for interaction within the learning space. This is, community agreements is a tradition that comes out of dialogue models, dialogic methods, that sort of says, before we even begin to engage with one another, here are the conditions that we need to meet, that we need to agree upon so that we can all feel welcomed and safe to fully participate as ourselves in this space. So some examples of community agreements that are pretty popular, pretty common. One is to agree that we are going to listen to one another for understanding. And understanding is different from listening for judgment, listening to criticize, listening to agree or disagree. We are going to listen to one another to make sure we understand. Practicing patience is another one. Another is an agreement to take space and make space. So be aware of the amount of space you're taking up in a discussion or dialogue. Be invited to take space, to participate, be empowered to do that, and be aware of making space and welcoming other people into the conversation. So what's great about this as an exercise, though, is you can, from day one, you can ask the students, what is it that helps you in learning environments to feel safe, fully participating? What makes for a really good environment for that for you? And that helps you to establish on day one to help students to feel heard and to have some agency in building the environment that they want to have in this classroom or in this learning space. Also, these community agreements are pretty helpful to have around to reference in the case where anyone speaks or acts in ways that violate these agreements. It's an easy way for you to bring everybody back, to remind them, these are our aspirational goals, these are our agreements. So if there's a comment or a behavior that steps outside of that, this is a kind of organizing way to bring people back to a center and keep things from sort of going off the rails. So community agreements is a practice I highly recommend. I use it when I'm working with any group teaching anything. Another thing you can do with the syllabus for the centralizing climate, try to convey some humanity and empathy in the syllabus. I don't know about you, but when I was first being trained as an educator, and I completed a certificate during my graduate work in college and university teaching, and I really looked at the syllabus as a contract and as something where I had to have really dry, really authoritative language all the way through that thing. I could not, if I put personality or humanity in there, it was going to somehow undercut my authority. There was all kinds of sort of scary things that I feared if I didn't write this as some kind of legal document that was devoid of any of me in there. And I've since learned that our students don't respond all that well to those kinds of syllabi. There's already a certain intimidation factor that happens between instructors, professors, and students. Our syllabi don't need to encourage that any more than they already do. So when I say to convey humanity and empathy, what I mean is share something about yourself in the syllabus that is not about your professor role. It doesn't have to be really deep. It doesn't have to be really personal, but even just knowing that you have dogs can help students to see you as a person, as a whole person, just like them, that learns, that makes mistakes, that gets dirty, that has failed before, all of those things. I know one of my colleagues who teaches organic chemistry, big scary OChem class, tells her class on the first day that the first exam she ever took in chemistry, she got a 53 on. And they all freak out and go, 53, that's an F. And she's like, oh, no, 53 out of 200. I got a 25%. And here she is, a PhD in chemistry. She starts off by sharing her failure to say, this is hard. It's hard for everybody. You can fail and it'll be okay. You can learn and you can get better. So conveying something about yourself, some humanity, and empathy can show up in a syllabus by designing a syllabus in a way where you're keeping the perspective of your students in mind, sort of sitting in their shoes and reading it. Where are the places in your syllabus that might cause some anxiety? You know, is it where they see how many points that final paper is worth? And they think, oh my God, that's really intimidating. Maybe in that spot in the syllabus, you can say something like, by the time you get here, you will have practiced, we will have gone through several drafts, you'll be ready for this. I mean, something where you can just kind of lower the stakes and practice some empathy in the syllabus. And then another thing you can do to cultivate that centralizing climate, again, showing that you are welcoming of diverse perspectives, is to promote resources that serve a diversity of student identities and experience. Where'd we go? There we are. That can serve a variety of student identities and experiences. So that, by that I mean, mention disability services, academic services, resources for those who experience financial hardship, basic needs, insecurity. If there are resources like that in your community or at your institution, include bias reporting procedures. All of that essentially conveys to students, I recognize that you all have different experiences in our community, on our campus, and I want to support you, whatever it is that these resources might support. I want you to know about them so that you can use them. One more thing about centralizing climate, and I'll say it's probably the one that causes us as folks who lead educational opportunities the most anxiety. It's the thing that I think requires the most practice, and that is to address microaggressions and harm when they occur in our classrooms, in the moment. So by this, I'm talking about, and maybe you've all probably experienced these are moments where maybe a student says something or does something, or maybe even we do, maybe we're the ones that say or do something, that you can immediately sense the weather changed, right? There's an immediate tension because something was said that could be offensive or that was insensitive, and it could target another identity group. So a microaggression happens. And remember, these are often unintentional. So it's not like somebody was trying to hurt someone else, but everybody sort of hears it. And there's maybe it's a gasp. It might not even be audible, but you can sense the temperature changed in the room. That is a moment that more often than not, faculty might notice, might not, but whether they notice it or not, they'll just push through it, not acknowledge it, not say anything, not process it, and just keep going. And let's hope that nobody else noticed, because we sort of freeze. There's a lot of things to be concerned about in that moment. I don't want to say something that makes it worse. I don't want to draw attention to it if nobody else noticed and I'm imagining it. may be a fear that I'm not an expert in whatever this issue is, and so I don't feel confident in facilitating a conversation. There's a lot of things that we are concerned about as educators in that moment. But I have to tell you that our response in that moment matters. It affects us, it affects the students in the room, and it absolutely affects our ability to maintain a centralizing climate where we are conveying that we value and welcome diverse identities and experiences. Ambrose goes so far to say, quote, "The way the instructor responds in the classroom in these moments is the final determinant of climate." Those moments, because no matter what we do to build a culture of trust and inclusion, when one of those moments happens and it harms and we don't address the harm, it can all sort of crumble. So we know that when these moments happen, our students experience negative emotions, they're more likely to disengage, they don't learn or perform as well, and really they lose their trust in us, in our ability to hold that space for them, that safety as we've intended it. So I'm going to encourage you, next time one of these things happens, to address it. And I'll give you some quick tips on how to do this. I think first, give yourself permission to pause. You don't have to fill that space right away. It's rare, and I've been practicing in dialogue for many years. I don't know what to say immediately. We just kind of have to go, oh, something occurred. Give yourself a permission to pause and breathe for a moment. If you're not comfortable pausing in silence, it's okay to talk through that, to say, okay, I just need a second. You can just pause. I'm just thinking about what I want to say. So pause, and then acknowledge what just happened. Just acknowledge that anything happened. Acknowledge that you can sense a change in the room temperature. Now I'll say, if you do this much and you don't do the next thing I'm going to bring up on the slide, you will have done more than a lot of us do. And students will give you quite a bit of credit for acknowledging that. Just the fact that you noticed it and you mentioned it and said, whoa, I just noticed that it seems a lot more tense in here right now. I can sense that. Do you sense that? Just a moment of connection, of shared experience. If you can move past that, if students don't automatically jump in and want to talk about it, then you move from acknowledgement to facilitating dialogue and helping students to process that moment. And you don't have to be a dialogue facilitator with experience. You don't have to be an expert on the content. What you can do is just prioritize the process. You don't have to immediately step in and correct something that someone said if it was offensive or wrong. You don't have to focus on what was said. You can just kind of focus on process to begin with. So asking questions is a great way to start. So Jean just mentioned that it's her perspective that a lot of people that grow up in impoverished communities don't ever really work very hard to move out of that space. So Jean, can you tell us more about, where did that perception come from? Is that something you learned about? Tell us more about where that idea comes from. So you're just creating space to engage whatever the idea was, whatever happened. You can ask some questions. Where's that coming from? And then encourage students to reflect on how they are experiencing that moment. And you could even share your own reflections. So I know that what Jean mentioned is a perspective that some people have. Like, that is a perspective that is out there in the world. And I know that when I hear it, it makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable. And I'm thinking about, why does it make me feel uncomfortable? You can kind of talk through your own reflection to model for students how they might engage in that. And then as you go, just make sure that you're affirming whatever you can. Affirm their emotions if they feel frustrated, if they're angry, if they're confused, if they're annoyed, whatever it is that they're feeling, affirm what you can. If there's course content that's relevant, bring that in to help them understand the moment. But try to engage that moment. Don't let it pass without addressing the harm that's done before you move on. If you can do that, I think you're going to go really far in being able to maintain that centralizing climate that you've been cultivating with your students. Okay, let's move into another category. Facilitating meaning making, in terms of what can we do, facilitating meaning making. So for minoritized students, there can be perceived hidden or implicit meanings behind any number of experiences related to their education. These are often linked to stereotypes or cultural beliefs, but they can serve as limiting factors for them. things that keep students from fully accessing or participating in learning opportunities. So these are ideas like getting help from a tutor means that I'm not smart, or I'm not good enough to be here, or I'm not good enough to study chemistry. Thoughts like professors and teachers are really important, they're really busy, I don't want to bother them, so meeting with them outside of class is going to be a burden, so I shouldn't bother them with the things that I need. So as faculty educators, as advisors, one of the most important things we can do is to help students reframe many of those experiences that they have that can result in these threats to their identity. Help them reframe that as a source of strength. So share messages with students that normalize struggle. Tell them that help seeking is something that successful students do, not weak students. Strong students seek help. That normalize difficulty, that college is hard, and it's supposed to be, and it's hard for everybody, not just you. Normalize that difficulty. Normalize a fear of not belonging. Everyone that comes into a new college community worries that they're not going to belong, they're not going to find their place. And normalize it as common and temporary, that everybody experiences it, and for the most part, people do find their place, but it takes time. So normalize those kinds of feelings of struggle, because students from marginalized communities can really take that in and think, I feel this way because of some kind of deficit in me. There's something wrong with me. And we need to be able to tell them, no, this is normal. We can also share messages that help students to value challenge as opposed to seeing difficulty as a threat. So we can help students to experience difficulty as a challenge, as that arousal you feel when you're nervous, that can actually help you to perform better if you see it as a challenge that you can meet, as opposed to something that is a threat. We can help students develop that growth mindset, something that emphasizes their ability to improve their skills with practice. We know that you can get there. This is not something that is innate. We all have to learn it. We all have to practice that growth mindset. We can also help them reframe failure. Failure for our students can really seem life or death. And for some folks, there's a high stakes on completing their education. Their education may be a way to lift them and their family out of poverty, for example. So failure can be really, really hard and can mean the world to some of our students. If we can help them to see exams, to see papers, to see these things as learning opportunities rather than strict evaluation, to frame failure as an opportunity and a normal part of learning. Like we know even neuroscience tells us that growth in the brain really only happens when you hit an obstacle, when you run into failure. You have to figure out a way around that failure, a way around that obstacle, and your brain grows whenever you have to do that. Like that's learning. So if we can help our students to shift their mindsets that matter a lot in promoting equitable student outcomes, we have the ability to influence their sense of inclusion and their outcomes in terms of learning and retention and completing their degree. So facilitate meaning making for our students. Increasing representation is one area where I think many of us have been working on this area for quite some time now in education, where one of the important ways we can signal to students that they belong is to show them the ways that their experiences and perspectives are already a part of our disciplines by diversifying our curriculum and the assigned material. And if their experiences and perspectives aren't traditionally or aren't already part of our disciplines, then we can acknowledge that and interrogate the effects of their exclusion on our understanding and our knowledge in our fields. So this is primarily achieved by diversifying the curriculum of our courses to include traditionally underrepresented authors, scholars, artists. But it's also really important to make this visible to our students. Recognize that if they just see a list of names on a list of readings in their syllabus, they will assume that those authors and scholars are white. They will assume they are male for the most part, because those are unmarked identities. So it can be good if you're going to diversify your curriculum, show pictures of these scholars, help students to recognize the different perspectives that are coming forward in the curriculum that you're offering them. But we also need to make sure we're practicing inclusion in our representation. So a sort of diversity representation is just to have diverse authors on the syllabus. An inclusive representation is to think more critically about when and how are marginalized perspectives integrated into my course. So how often are these authors showing up? Are diverse perspectives represented by a single story? Or is the diversity of experiences and perspectives within a group acknowledged? Do I have a single day in my syllabus that comes at the end of the semester where we talk about marginalized voices, or is it integrated throughout? So ask yourself those sorts of questions to practice greater inclusion in your representation. And you might also investigate traditional ways of ordering and structuring your curriculum to be able to challenge some of the hierarchies that we reproduce when we tend to teach the history of our courses, for example, or the history of our fields in chronological order. And when we do that, we tend to center and sort of foreground Western white male works. So if we're always talking about our fields chronologically, we're not going to see women, we're not going to see contributors of color for quite some time, and we will have centered only one perspective. So ask yourself, how can I increase representation, but also challenge the hierarchy of how knowledge is produced in the way that I'm structuring my courses? And if you want some examples, I can share some a little bit later on. But since we want time for questions, I want to keep going here. Another way to think about increasing your representation is if your field doesn't traditionally engage these issues of identity and difference, you can discuss those issues, but think about ways that you can include it without kind of shoehorning it in ways that don't feel appropriate. So for example, one of my colleagues who teaches biology course, she has her students, it's a physiology course, and she has her students Google an image of a human large intestine as they're learning about the large intestine. She has them Google for images of this. And just before she moves on to get into the anatomy of everything, she asks them, how many pages on Google does it take for you to click through images of a human intestine before you get to a person of color? Let's just see. Let's just notice the representation in these images of the human anatomy. And she finds, in case you're wondering, that it takes 11 pages, 11 Google pages to get to a large intestine that is not in a white body. And she just asked the students briefly to interrogate that like, what is the message that is sent when only white bodies are used in textbook images of anatomy? So that's just a moment to let people know I'm thinking about this. And I see if you are not white, I see that you're not represented here. And I want to acknowledge that because you probably notice it. If you're embodying that identity, you probably notice it. I want us all to notice it. That's another way of increasing representation. And then finally, to develop culturally responsive learning experiences for underrepresented groups. And by that, I referred to this a little bit earlier, finding ways to connect what students are learning to their own communities, their own experiences. So an example of this, teaching in a chemistry course, taking up the issue of the Flint water crisis. You can talk about the chemistry of water within the crisis of the ways in which Black communities were disproportionately affected by contaminated water in Flint, Michigan. Right? So culturally responsive learning experiences help provide these relevant opportunities to connect with what students are learning, and makes it more personally relevant and engaging for them. Okay, so we're increasing representation, we're cultivating a centralizing climate, we're getting to know our students and reflecting. I also mentioned the importance of decreasing uncertainty. And I'm going to move through this fairly quickly, but I think the bottom line for decreasing uncertainty is making certain that we understand that uncertainty is pretty aversive for everybody, for all humans. This is partly why living through this COVID-19 pandemic has had such a detrimental effect on our individual and collective mental health. When we are anxious, we don't have a sense of control. It just takes up a lot of cognitive resources. So knowing that means it's going to affect our students' outcomes. So we want to decrease uncertainty wherever we can. And there's a lot of places of uncertainty for our students when it comes to their learning. They might be uncertain about what our expectations are. what does it take for me to succeed in class? So if we can provide clear instructions, we can provide transparency, tell students, why are we doing what we're doing? What's the learning goal? What's the purpose of what we're doing? Uncover that hidden curriculum so that they understand exactly what it is you're asking them to do and why you're asking them. So review your syllabus for jargon. Use the term student hours instead of office hours so that they know that is time where they're supposed to come and see you. They may also be uncertain about their own abilities. I don't know what it takes to succeed, and do I have what it takes to succeed? I met a philosophy professor at a conference one year who talked about philosophy being this really intimidating subject where students tend to see it as these kind of sages on the mountaintop, and you have to have this wisdom to be able to be a philosopher. And he would start his semester by talking about, what does it take to be a good philosopher? Well, good philosophers are good listeners. They are close readers. So he'd talk about specific characteristics. And then he would actually do an exercise with them that really acted as a self-affirmation, where he had them write down a bunch of examples of times when they demonstrated those characteristics of a good philosopher. When have you shown yourself to be a good listener? When have you shown yourself to be a close reader? And after he did that exercise, he met with each of his students, coming into student hours, and actually talked with them about how they could leverage those skills and strengths to succeed in his philosophy course. So really saying, here's what it takes to succeed. Show yourself that you have what it takes, and let's connect the dots. So really looking for spaces for self-affirmation, and also building a climate that helps build the students' confidence. So another professor, an example I can give is a professor that had a background in theater improv. If you're familiar with improvisation in theater, there's a practice called yes and, where no matter what somebody says in an improvisation, if you are on that stage, you have to run with it. You have to affirm it, yes and then you add to it. So he actually used the rule of yes and in discussions in class. So that if you want to participate in the discussion, if someone says something, you first have to say yes and, meaning you have to find something in what they said that is interesting, that is intriguing, that is exciting, and try to build on that before you offer a critique, before you offer a different perspective. What's the yes and? And can you imagine if students are always getting that feedback that says something I said was valuable and someone heard it, what kind of effect that can have on building confidence? There's also uncertainty about how they're performing. And that's why it's important that we're giving feedback frequently, that there are lots of low stakes opportunities for students to understand how they are doing with their learning experiences, and that we provide what's known as wise feedback. So wise feedback is feedback that communicates high standards, that we believe in students' abilities, and that we will provide concrete steps for support. And WISE is in italics here because WISE is a phrase that's used to indicate strategies that will convey to students that they won't be treated or judged in terms of a negative stereotype, that they will be respected and viewed as an individual. So WISE feedback is important to decrease uncertainty. So I want to make sure to leave us some time for Q&A. So I'm going to there's just one more section and I'm going to just hop forward, but I promise that I will share these slides with you all, and so you can look back on it. But the only other thing I was going to mention before I wrap this up was embracing flexibility, and just to draw your attention to all the flexible methods that we have incorporated during the COVID-19 pandemic, embracing universal design, giving students a lot of opportunities and choices with how they do their assignments, with what the topics are, with how they demonstrate their learning to us, and really highlighting for you that flexibility can go really well with rigor, and that we don't have to switch one for the other. So embracing flexibility can be a way to create more equitable outcomes for our students. And then in the end, we got to make sure we're paying attention to what the results are. So figuring out what is it that we want to look at, what are we going to measure to figure out if it's working, and then keeping track of those things. What are the outcomes? Practicing that accountability, reporting on those things, and then adjusting based on the information that we get back from that measurement. And I'm happy to provide more information about that if you're interested. So I just want to wrap us up by focusing on what equity-minded practice can bring to us. So our goal is we want our students to feel included. We want them to feel a sense of belonging. And the goal of that is to make sure that they can experience equitable outcomes, that everyone can see over that fence, and maybe even that we get rid of the fence entirely. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that many of the interventions I've described today could be thought of as individual level interventions. So changing mindsets and framing, helping students think or do things differently than they might otherwise. And I think it's important to recognize that although we might intervene to produce greater equity at the individual level, to truly be equity-minded, we need to be interrogating the broader structures and systems that contribute to students experiencing stereotype threat, to experiencing self-doubt and a lack of belonging. It can be tempting to look at the strategies that I described that can create greater equity and locate then the responsibility for closing equity gaps within the students themselves. But that would be a conclusion that is inconsistent with equity-mindedness. We really need to be looking at what we can do. What are we doing that is creating barriers for our students? And how can we take responsibility to remove those barriers? So my goal for our time today was to provide you with a deeper understanding of the conditions that lead to exclusionary learning environments and inequities, and some individual strategies that you could implement right away to promote equity and belonging in your classes and learning spaces. However, in order to truly create an inclusive and equitable institution where these learning opportunities are happening, we have to change the structures that marginalize certain groups of students by further diversifying our faculty, staff, and student bodies. We have to change the structures that maintain hierarchies of knowledge production, voice, and leadership, and that create these barriers to equity in the first place. Only when we are all taking responsibility for how we can break down these barriers within our own spheres of influence will we truly be able to see the benefits institution-wide in reduced gaps in learning, in participation, achievement, retention, and ultimately graduation for all of our students. So with that, I'm going to close my formal remarks. Thank you so much for your attention and your commitment to being here on a Friday night, to improving equity, engagement, and access for all your students. I look forward to answering any questions you might have, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Vick. I'm sure you've given us, I know you've given me a lot to think of. Excuse me. I have taken a lot of notes, and I know that others probably have a lot of questions as well. Earlier, I put something in the chat that basically said I'm monitoring the chat. If you have questions that you'd like to pose to Dr. Vick, please do so there. And that way I can kind of moderate them and we're not talking over each other as we're trying to be heard. With that, though, I do have a question that came in earlier that I think will be a good one to get us started with. And the question was, so the question basically said, you mentioned mistakes that people make as we learn, right? And so how do we balance the need for individuals to make and learn mistakes, right? As we're trying to be more equity minded within this increasingly polarized political environment, or, you know, where some people feel as though if they make a mistake, they may be a victim of cancel culture or something like that, right? So how do you do that, right, in this culture that does not seem to accept or value mistakes in moving forward towards equity and justice?
Wonderful question. And actually talking about canceling was something that I couldn't figure out how to fit in my talk, but I really would have liked to talk about it. So I appreciate that question. It is scary out there. The thought that there is no room for mistakes anymore, because everything is harm, everything is violence, and we can't be learning. What I try to do, what I hope that we can all do, is to model how we respond when others make mistakes when they're in our presence. So what do I mean by that? I think part of what I described in responding to microaggressions in the classroom was modeling not canceling a student, if they make a comment, or anybody else who's in the class, not canceling them, not calling them out by shaming them, which is what calling out really is. It's sort of about a public humiliation or shaming. We have to communicate that the goal in our learning communities is to learn. And people don't learn when they are shamed, when they are made to feel defensive. When we are defensive, our ears close. We're no longer in a space where we can hear and listen. So what I try to help students think about, and I've actually led some workshops with students at Muhlenberg about calling in as opposed to calling out and what the difference is. And what Loretta Ross talks about in her work on calling in is that calling in has a different goal. Calling out, the goal is to let someone know they made a mistake by shaming and humiliating them. With calling in, the goal is to learn so that we can do better next time. So part of where I try to remind students when there is a call out that's happening, I will interrupt it and I will remind them, what are we doing here together? We are here together because we're privileged enough to be sharing in a learning community. We need to create spaces where we are free to learn. And when we are learning, we make mistakes. So that there has to be space for that. What students will sometimes challenge me with, though, is there has to be accountability. And that's where calling out, that's where students love calling out, or really any of us, that they equate calling out with accountability. Someone has to know they made a mistake and they have to do something about that. Like they have to know. We can let people know that mistakes were made. We can practice accountability without calling out and canceling. So another piece that I will teach and try to model is, how do we respond when we do make a mistake? Can we show people how to maintain their integrity, their dignity in that space, and hear that? So just recently, actually, I was leading a dialogue workshop where I was training our student government on intergroup dialogue techniques. And I learned when I sent them into a breakout room, one student sent me a note and told me that I had been mispronouncing one of their names. And this was a student of color, one of the few that was in the space. I immediately knew this is more than just a mistake that doesn't matter. Our names really matter, especially names that come from other cultures. They're always mispronounced, is really invalidating. And while they were in their breakout rooms, I knew, well, at first I was freaking out because I felt really bad. And then I thought, I can model what accountability looks like for them when they come back into this space. And so when they came back in, I said, I want to acknowledge, before we talk about what you were just discussing, I have been mispronouncing the name of one of our peers, Rashetta. I am incredibly sorry that I've been mispronouncing your name. And of course, she's on the screen going, it's fine, because that's more comfortable. I stayed with it for a minute, though. I was like, I know you want to let me off the hook, and I'm so grateful for that. It's very generous. But I want to acknowledge our names are important. And if there was any time in this space where you felt like you had to spend some of your energy worried about how I was going to say your name next, I apologize. And everybody else, this is how you say her name. So please don't make a mistake. It's Rashetta. And I got lots of comments in the chat and lots of students that said, wow, thank you very much for that. And then we moved on. The tension was gone. So I think we have to try to model that with each other. If there's ever a time when you're in a space and someone else is being called out, how can you model that you are welcoming them in and that you will listen and teach and learn? And then when you make a mistake, you can model, here's how I'm going to practice accountability. I think that's the best way to do it. I will also share, if you're interested in learning more about methods to avoid calling out and canceling, I recommend the work of Adrienne Marie Brown. We actually just brought her to our campus, and she gave a talk, and the talk was called, and I think this is the title of her book, We Will Not Cancel Us. And it is all about how do we engage across difference in these sensitive ways where people may be harmed by mistakes that we make, and stay in community with one another. Because that's really the only way that we're going to make progress, is if we stay in community and work through those moments of difficulty and harm. I hope that helps answer your question.
I think it did. I'm speaking for the person. I didn't ask the question, so I didn't mean to center my experience, unfortunately. I do have a comment. I don't know that it says much a question, but this is a comment that says, Dr. Vick's insight into diversity, equity, and inclusion in the learning space are directly applicable to the workplace. I hope I pronounced this correctly, Gemba or Gemba, where value is added to products and services by employees who can be valued and recognized to produce amazing results. So I said to this person, what is Gemba or Gemba? And I learned that it's a Japanese word that means where production or service takes place. So I hope I pronounced that correctly. But anyway, I thought that was a nice little bit of a response and one that you should hear. I'm sorry, did anyone else have a question? And then I didn't mean to talk over whoever was, I believe, was that you, Dr. Vick, that was going to?
Oh yeah, that was just me making agreeable noises. Thank you for that comment, whoever offered it. Appreciate that.
Okay, I have a question, and this one says, my question, in Tennessee, teachers are fired for anything that is perceived as critical race theory. For example, the example that the keynote speaker used of large intestines in minority person. Google pages will be perceived as CRT. In such a political environment, how can instructors navigate issues of inclusion and belonging and equality?
That's a tough one. I've been thinking about this in solidarity with our educator friends who are in places where they maybe can't take some of this advice and research supported wisdom on what good teaching looks like. And it's a really unfortunate situation, and really, I think, comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of what critical race theory really is. But whether or not that, that aside, that is the reality. And we and our educators need to be able to protect themselves. I think, unfortunately, what that kind of policy is promoting is sort of a colorblind, identity blind kind of inclusion, which we know is not as effective as specifically naming some of the areas of difference, like mentioning race differences, like mentioning gender and ability differences that way. Unfortunately, that focus really just focuses on race more than it does on other areas of difference. So I think that what those teachers kind of have to do, unfortunately, is sort of a watered down version of these things. So we can create, in those kinds of restrictive spaces, we can create opportunities for students to share themselves. So like some of the icebreaker kinds of activities I mentioned, or the information forum where maybe we're not specifically bringing up race, but students can. And so are there ways, I assume students can't get fired from their classrooms. I hope not. So if we are asking them to introduce themselves, to talk about their similarities and differences, to share parts of themselves with us, if we can create a climate where they can share those parts of themselves that are identity related, that might give us an opening, where at least we're trying to create a climate where they feel like they can do that. I think the hardest part to navigate, that I know I would really struggle with, is, what does representation look like in that educational environment? Is it the case that teaching about anyone's perspective that is not white, is that something that they will see as promoting critical race theory? I don't know the answer to that question, but I would look for ways to include diverse perspectives, even if you have to do it without drawing attention to it. And perhaps that's the line, right? So I mentioned in my comments that you can diversify the perspectives that are in the curriculum, and please draw attention to that so that students know, and you talk about that. Maybe that's the part that educators in Tennessee can't do, is to draw attention to the representation, to directly engage the historical exclusion. But they could still include those stories I'm hoping, but maybe just not interrogate inclusion and exclusion and the history of that in their fields. But it is a really unfortunate development, and I sure hope it's temporary. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, we have another question. I think we're probably coming up against time, so anyone who else can speak to the notion of time and where we need to be moving, please let me know. But I do have one more question, and this is, well, okay, so the first question is about creating an inclusive asynchronous online course, right? Because a lot of people are teaching this, particularly in this environment now.
Mm-hmm.
The second question, and I think we're going to have to wrap these up or wrap them together, hopefully, is how can you encourage a campus-wide inclusive learning environment? And what strategies or resources can you provide that somebody could use to have that conversation with an administrator?
Okay. So asynchronous, inclusive environment, and just making sure I understood you, Dr. Evans, the creating an inclusive campus community. So not just within a classroom, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
And resources that enable them to speak to upper level administrators.
Okay. So with the asynchronous content, this is a relatively new experience for a lot of us in higher ed, but now many of us have it post or when we're dealing with the pandemic. With asynchronous stuff, it's a lot of where you can give the cues for inclusion, besides the curriculum itself and the offerings, is in the asynchronous interactions that occur. You know, where can you provide affirmation and validation and welcoming of diverse voices and experiences? So I think about when we are engaging students in discussion boards, when we are providing them with prompts to respond to, when we are asking students to engage with one another, you know, what kinds of content are we setting them up to engage with? What is represented in the assessments and the learning experiences, the examples that are offered. So a lot of the things that would happen outside of our classrooms, so like assignments and the readings and the video materials, the podcasts, all of those sorts of things, can pull in a diversity of stories and perspectives and experiences. And we can still do that asynchronously. And we can also encourage students to be sharing with one another the way we do with icebreakers when we're in a physical classroom together. They can do that asynchronously offline as well. And we just provide the structure where it's clear that we're encouraging that. In terms of creating an inclusive campus environment, this is at the heart of my job right now, is helping Muhlenberg to do just that. And I think it's not an easy answer because it requires a lot of different things. It's why we have the big complicated things like strategic plans, where it includes policies and processes and activities and things. But I think from a student experience perspective, the things that make them feel most included when they're just on campus walking around is representation. It is, what is up on the walls, what events are being offered, what is the food like in the dining spaces? Can I find food from my culture? Are my holidays recognized? Are there messages coming out from the leadership that is acknowledging Indigenous Peoples Day, that is acknowledging Rosh Hashanah, that is acknowledging Diwali is coming up? Those sorts of cultural touchstones. That's what I hear from students on campus is some of the visual reminders that we are a multicultural, diverse community, where I can see myself in the rituals, in the food, in the clothing, in the themes. If we were holding a symposium that is a campus community event, what is the theme that we are all focused on this year? Is it inclusive of diverse perspectives and voices? So I think it's things like that. And then of course, all of that has to have support from the top. So the question about how do you engage upper level administrators in that is a really important and insightful question. It is really hard to drive the giant ship fully from the bottom up. You've got to have that support at the top. And if you have administrators that are that maybe aren't fully on board yet, or that need a little bit more convincing. I think the key is getting a sense of where the hesitancy is coming from, or what it might take to convince them to move the needle a little bit. And people that are in roles like mine, and I'm sure Dr. Evans and Dr. Natuli and others that have this expertise understand that there's a lot of different cases to be made for advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like there's a moral case you can make, there's a justice case you can make, there's a business case you can make, there's an educational outcomes case you can make, there's a money case you can make, progress, creativity. I think Mark mentioned some of these things earlier in his remarks. So really trying to tailor the strategy to bring people along with what it is that will motivate them. So I know I don't often like giving the business case because that's not where my heart is. That's not what motivates me to be in the work. But when I'm talking to our college board of trustees, which I do every time they come for a meeting, I know that the board of trustees, their primary job is to have fiduciary responsibility for the institution. Like it's their job to make sure that the college continues, that we are not in the red, right? So if I want them to get on board with DEI stuff, I've got to talk about the ways in which that helps our bottom line. Now, it's not the only thing I talk about, but I make sure it's in there because I know that that's part of what will motivate them. So I would recommend for administration figuring out what is their responsibility, what's likely to motivate them, and then working with the experts in your community at Idaho State or wherever you are to figure out how to present that case. But luckily, equity, inclusion, diversity, I don't know that there are any negatives. It is really, there is a case to be made for nearly every sphere of the work that we do. It's just a matter of finding that information and sharing it in a strategic way.
Thank you so much.